yet another week. Thank you so much to everyone for the little messages and for being so supportive of the scheduling change of these episodes, no longer dropping weekly due to my life change of moving and starting postgrad studies. I'm really excited to announce this week's episode because I get to chat with one of my favourite people and my very good friend, artist and filmmaker James Nguyen. You might be wondering why I've decided to bring on someone who's an artist and someone who's not explicitly a classical musician, but it's because although James isn't a professional musician, he has a great deal of experience in working with or collaborating with the world of classical music, from him taking lessons throughout his childhood to his considered collaborations and thinking about decolonization. It's sometimes important to consider the thoughts and impressions of those who do not directly work within the classical music industry in order to take a look from an outsider's perspective as to its challenges. In fact, it was James himself who encouraged me to make this podcast. So welcome, James.
Not a problem. Yeah, total pleasure. I get to hang out with you.
And this time our hangout is on record. So how do I start this in a semi-formal way? So, you know what, in all the previous episodes, what I've decided to do has been a good way to start a conversation and introduce those who might not be familiar with your work to them, is to ask how your experience with classical music has led you to the position you're in now. Because although you're an artist and a filmmaker, you once studied classical music, particularly, as many people do, they study it when they're growing up. So it's a bit of a weird starting question, but why did you decide to stop?
I think I stopped being a musician when I started doing art. There was like a definite no overlap. I'm like, I can't be both. That's impossible.
So do you think it was restrictive doing classical music, particularly the way it's taught? Hence it's affecting you and pondering whether or not it was something that you wanted to pursue professionally?
I don't know, like how I went about it was always the wrong way, I guess. Like, I was always, maybe because of my bad eyesight, like I was always much better at copying what people did. So I listened and mimicked sound. And so my violin teacher would give up making me do sight reading and she would play it. And then I'll copy her and then I'll be fine. So yeah, I would always do miserably at sight reading in all the exams because I basically just copied and mimicked. Yeah, and also I didn't practice a lot. Like I hated practicing. I'd rather like watch cartoons. But yeah, and my violin teacher would be really pissed off because I wouldn't progress. Like there would be no sign of progress, yeah, until like maybe 1 month or so before the exams, when I'll just cram, and then I'll just like watch videos of people like. At the time there weren't that many videos, but like if you could like go to the library and find cassettes and you could listen to music, and then I would do that and then cram, and then I'll try to mimic the sound as much as I could, and then I would do really well in exams. Yeah, I would work well under pressure, but I thought, yeah, like I couldn't be a professional musician. I had not a very good teacher, and so I had really bad technique. And so that technique carried through. So like I couldn't unteach myself like the bad bowing technique because I'd hate bowing like really close to the frog. It was like a combination of bad technique, bad application, and so I gave up.
All fine, because now you're an artist and a filmmaker. But you've started like integrating music into your work. Was there a reason why, other than the fact that you kind of need sound to do film and you need music to some degree in film? Was there a reason why you started working with people like Kezia and then eventually me and then still both of us?
Like I think sound is always really important. Like, yeah, my friends and I always have this discussion where we're like, wow, if you were cursed and you had the choice, would you be deaf or blind? And my answer would always be, I'd rather be blind, even though that's horrible. Like no one wants to be blind. But I'm like, as long as I can listen and hear music and I can hear the conversations around me, I can still like cry over sad music. Whereas I've never cried over a sad painting. Like I've never seen someone break down in front of like a a physical artwork, whereas I've seen people like cry at the theater and cry at music concerts, like even at the pub, like you cry over a beer, you don't cry over art. I'll always prioritize sound, but I think what really consolidated it was like when I was at Uniondocs in New York, like we were running around making like short documentaries and stuff. And we had this workshop where one of the filmmakers said, look, if you are making a film and the sound is terrible, but you've shot beautiful footage, people would tolerate it for like 30 seconds. Whereas if you recorded the sound really well and you put it together and it's not awful, but your footage is shaky and shitty and it's blown out, people would sit there and watch it because they're like, oh, this looks like art because it looks bad but it sounds really great. And so and so kind of like that really instilled in me that sense that actually film, which is like a very visual medium, is actually a very auditory kind of art form, right? And also when I think about performance and dance, like when you perform, a lot of the times it's when you're performing to an audience, you kind of like also listen to them. Like you might be like dancing in a really awkward way where you can't see them, or you're like performing in a way that where you can't see your audience, but you can almost hear like their anticipation and you can hear how much attention they're paying to you. Are they talking or are they laughing? Like you could hear all those things and you could really feel it. And so to me, sound was always a priority. If I was gonna make any artwork, I would always try to bring in a really good sound designer. Like another friend who I've worked with previously is like Hayley Forward, and she's amazing. Do you know her? Or
Yep. I've seen some of her work and she's really, really cool.
and so are you and Kezia. And so kind of like I was thinking about how when you're making film and visuals, there's always this hierarchy of, the producer or the director. You have a story writer, like cinematographer, a sound recordist, and then a sound designer. And sound always gets shuffled down to the bottom, even though it's kind of like the most emotive and important part. And so for me, in my work, I wanted to bring my sound friends along and kind of like learn from them and kind of like collaborate with them in kind of like a more flattened and even engagement, I think. Yeah, I think that's really important. Just kind of like calling someone in and going, I need, like some sound to fill in this spot, and I need that kind of like art sound where it's kind of like this drone. I'm like, that's basically someone going into your studio going, I need a painting that's blue to match my couch. Like you're never going to be painting your best painting when someone walks in and has a shopping list and dictates to you what they need. Like I think your best work is always after you've had a conversation and hang out and you're like, hey, what can we do together? Sometimes it's clunky and crap, but you work really hard to make it kind of enjoyable, at least, like you're not kind of like delivering some sort of, I don't know, arbitrary brief. The brief is more like friendship and laughter and conversation, which makes it super cute.
And also, I think you create a more cohesive collaboration by working like this, especially when it comes to combining different art forms and perspectives. Other than working with you, I've worked with maybe 2 or 3 quite young short filmmakers or aspiring filmmakers, and often either the director or the producer. Well, I mean, they call themselves a director. These cute little 18-year-olds.
I'm a producer. I'm directing this. I'm important.
Well, one incident, which was the last time before you that I had worked with a film person, and I went, no, I'm never doing this again, because the young director emailed myself with a brief, as they normally do. So they say things like, our film is 4 minutes long, here is our style, here's one piece of music to demonstrate what we're looking for. And in this instance, it was a 7-minute piece from the film Up. Anyways, that will always happen. They'll give you a demo in the style they want, and it's almost always something that's incredibly highly produced and impossible to replicate. And in this instance, it was because the film itself was half the length of the piece of music they'd sent as a sample. Anyways, and as usual, like barely any budget, I think it was $200. But what transpired was this director gave me a basic contract in terms of how pay operated, deadlines, etc., etc. And then a friend of mine, because I don't think he realized how small the world of composition or music was talking to me about the short film she was working on. And then we realized it was the same film. So he'd been shopping around for someone to collaborate with, and they would have dropped whoever they weren't happy with. So we both emailed him, and they were screwed because suddenly they had no composer really close to the deadline. So just a note to any directors out there, or really any artist, please don't do that to anyone you
I don't
work
know,
with.
like when you're making a work, you want to care for it, and caring for it means spending a long period of time building up these relationships and conversations, right? You just don't go, who is like a sexy composer who has a really big social network, who, if they're in my film, I can reach a bigger audience, because like that's so bullshit. Like, yeah, you don't shop for people's skills and fame or whatever. Like, yeah, you basically, that's yucky. Like, no artist wants you want someone to, like it's like a relationship.
Yeah.
You want to feel wanted and just not like disposable.
Also, you're supposed to be telling the story together for it to feel successful is the wrong word, but for it to feel meaningful in some way. So you have to get a good cohesive team together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, and sometimes, yeah, like that team, you have to give it time to find itself, right? Like the worst is to end up rushing these collaborations before you kind of like, I don't know, like I think I kind of like having friendships and stuff before you really collaborate. Maybe because I'm a control freak and I need to trust that that person cares enough about a project to invest time in it. Talked and thought things through, and all the thinking processes have been done together. Like, and at the end, when you're desperately slapping stuff together, those things actually came from some beautiful conversations and stuff.
Yes, and those conversations are so important and so crucial. Otherwise, it's very difficult to create anything artistic, musical, or whatever, isolated and on your own. I think there is great affection and great love for that idea of, well, I don't know where it came from, perhaps media or some figures from our history that are now legendary, but there is great love for the notion of a singular genius. And it exists in science and art, and we really love that idea of an independent genius, but it's a complete fallacy and it's not possible because there are tactile, social, and practical elements of working and conversing with others in an exchange of ideas and processes or basic things like storytelling and discussing repertoire. In classical music, for example, some of the classical composers exist in this very special bubble and they're revered for being this certain kind of genius, but of course it comes down to context, family, prestige, support, and their environment, and the fact that we are now obsessively playing their music on endless rotation. But I suppose the art world has figures like that, like Van Gogh, whose stories are also on endless rotation and they're spoken about in a certain light. And in his case, it's about creativity somehow born out of his very unfortunate daily experiences with mental health. However, at the end of the day, I don't think storytelling can exist without support from a community on both ends, from either when you're creating it or when you're actually presenting and sharing it.
How I think about it, it's like there's never been an artist genius. There's no such thing, right? Like, if you think about the Renaissance, like, from Giotto to kind of like Raphael and all that, like, there was a continuity, there was a community. There was not only painters and fresco people and sculptors and stuff, like they were in a mire of like Medici money and and like church money, and also like the capacity to kind of like exchange and have conversations, right? And also they all trained under different studios, under different masters or leaders or teachers, and kind of like that idea of the teacher is so important in kind of like the progress of art, right? Like I always think how kind of like our bodies are archives, because it picks up and it retains things that are kind of important to us, but it can never retain everything. So you kind of rely on other bodies to supplement your archive. Yeah, and also you die, and so your archive disappears. And before it disappears, you need to pass on what's important to the next people and allow them to percolate these documents within them. And yeah, I think that artist genius thing, fucking Vasari.
Ruined it all for us.
I know, ruined it all.
And in music, it's Mozart, because the image of a genius child prodigy is a thing we have in classical music. And I will say that to a degree, they kind of exist, because there are always really young virtuosic performers and solo performers. That seems to be quite present in classical music. But it breeds this idea that's like really similar to elite sports, that if you're older than 20, you somehow can't make it as a soloist, which is totally untrue. And if anyone out there is studying right now, please know that that's not the case.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the crazy thing about, like investing so much time and obsession with these geniuses is that you can exclude so much. Like it becomes easy to exclude. Like, if you're only paying attention to, baby Mozart, then you kind of like ignore all of Mozart's kind of like peers and friends and whatever. Like it makes me think of Yo-Yo Ma. Like his poor sister. What the fuck?
Yeah. Also Mozart's sister, we always forget about her.
Mozart had a sister? I
She
didn't
had a
know.
sister.
Tell me.
Yeah, he had a sister, and she was also a brilliant violinist and harpsichordist, and I think she's actually started composing at an earlier age than he did and continued to do so up until the point where she was married. And somewhere there's a letter from their father, Leopold, that alludes to her being even more skilled than her younger brother. And, there are probably many reasons why we don't hear much about her. But if we think about how both Mozarts, or, the Mozart, has become such an important thing, it's that the family was in a political and a financial position in which they could facilitate both of their children to be talented musically in this way with such intensity. And not everyone has access to lessons and people, aristocracy, or money in the way that that particular family did.
It's like sports, right? Like all these things are, a process of sacrifice. To get a Olympic sports person, you know, you've had to have this family willing to invest all of their time waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning to drive them to the pool or whatever. And it's pretty much the same with musicians. Like, it is an investment, and families move cities to find the perfect teacher and make connections and all these things. And yeah, like it's kind of freaky.
Well, it is, and it doesn't just stop when you're a child. Once you get to a certain age and you want to go to a conservatorium and, you know, you're really ambitious and talented and you want to go to a place to, oh God, what's extreme? Say you want to go to Juilliard. You want to go to Juilliard in New York and you have to move countries, and then you need a certain amount of money to do that, particularly if you just didn't manage to get a scholarship. And it just keeps going on and on like this. But that applies to everything from artistic creation all the way to academics.
Yeah, like a lot of times, like we forget to talk about class, in that the only reason why we as ethnic people can invest, you know, our time and effort into kind of like these superfluous art forms is because a lot of times our parents are economically stable. They've gone past that, you know, like the teething of resettlement, and it takes kind of like the second generation to start to have the capacity and ability to invest, yeah, all the time and resources into producing crap. Like, you know, like it takes a long period of time to develop these things. You know, like there's probably thousands of Yo-Yo Ma's, right? But only 5 people can probably afford to invest the time and money into allowing that child to flourish. And in Yo-Yo Ma's case, his poor sister, right? Like I only just learnt about her just recently. What is it, like Yo Chang Ma? She was like an incredible like violinist, right?
Mm.
And her family went, the boy would probably make us more money. And so you, girl, learn the piano so that you can support your brother with the cello.
Oh, as an accompanist, that's right.
Yeah. And so it was kind of like this crazy thing where she was this child prodigy in the violin, but they decided that it was probably at the time, you know, like an Asian girl playing the violin was not interesting or would not be supported. Whereas like it's this, you know, a cute little Asian boy with an oversized cello, people would like swoon over that shit, right? And so the poor sister had to become the accompanist for her whole life. And that just totally breaks my heart. I'm like, what? How's that? No. Yeah, and then so it's that sense of genius is crazy because, you know, like without the investment of his parents and also the forced sacrifice of his sister,
Mm.
you know, like to give up everything to be his accompanist because, you know, there's 2 cute Asian kids on stage, like he wouldn't have had those opportunities and capacity to develop into this world-renowned performer. Like it's, yeah, so yeah, it's this amount of level of support and people around you that kind of just magically disappears when you win, you know, the Mozart Prize or whatever.
I'm sure there's a competition out there called the Mozart Prize.
Yeah.
For our first intermission, James has chosen some excellent music to accompany this episode. First up is an excerpt of a 2005 work by Gabriela Lena Frank called Canto de Harawi Amadesio, performed here by Ensemble Mime. So, do you think all of this perception about art is driven by the media, that it touts this idea that is so widely spread and acknowledged in the public, this unreachable artistic achievement for an individual?
I think the economy was so geared towards personal achievement, personal gain, and the single artistic genius, you know, like overcoming whatever unsurmountable situations to become this amazing creative. Like, I think the economy really loves that because it forces you to think that as an individual, everyone can achieve these things, even though they can't. And so people invest time and effort into achieving these things by themselves. In sports as well, you know, like, yeah, like we celebrate the individual when really the individual relies on so many people around them. And actually the sacrifice is so many. And maybe that's like a boring story to tell. But I don't know. Like, I think maybe it's changing now when like people actually love hearing about the struggles of a sporting family or the struggles of, you know, like a migrant family putting everything into their child. And what people also love is when that child fails, because it's quite entertaining to watch. Like 10 years down the track, what happened to them? Like, it's this weird thing of being obsessed with the individual that I kind of don't feel comfortable with.
I remember a while back when we were talking about process, and essentially that it goes back to how much more fruitful it is to collaborate in order to create music and art. Sometimes I meet very specific creators or artistic practitioners who claim that they can only create music or only create at all when they're in a specific mood. But I often think, you know what, the conversations going around me, I kind of need them to nourish work, or really what I often find to be more important and more provoking is nourishing the thoughts or thinking in a different way. For example, I can read as much as I like from academic texts or biographies, but that would limit the ability in which to apply those skills and modes of operating into an actual practice. I don't think it would be happening particularly with responsibility or any sense of accountability, without conversations with others, such as you.
Yeah, like I think information is presented to us as kind of like these discrete units or discrete modules. And that's how kind of like the West loves to categorize things, right? But yeah, when you have these conversations, like those barriers between knowledge is kind of like shifted and pushed around from person to person, and you kind of like contest and argue and also, you know, shape your words around someone else's thoughts, and then they shape theirs around yours. And so it's this beautiful, weird contestation, competition, dance, whatever it is. And that's how you can bridge knowledge and create new knowledge, I think.
So do you think that's been evident in all the research you've been doing for your PhD in terms of balancing how academic works as a structure with your artistic practice?
Like in my PhD, basically I just whinge about everything.
Professional whinging. With sources.
I know. Referenced whinging. It's very important.
Do you find that a really weird thing to, like, the process of referencing in order to validate all your responses is actually quite odd? And it's something that, you know, the Western structure of academia forces us to do if we choose to study anything even remotely academic.
It's kind of like, it brings back to like my bad way of practicing and learning classical music, right? Like my academic work is slightly horrendous in that I just like write down whatever I want. And because of technology now, I'm like, these are the keywords that I need to have supported. And so I'm like, click, click, click into the search engine. I'm like, click, 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 keywords, skim. And then I just skim through like papers and
Google Scholar, right? That has all the
and scholars who support my opinion. It's horrendous, right? Like you end up kind of producing knowledge that's narcissistic, but also you're just finding sources that support your own rather than looking more broadly and really challenging yourself. But I think I shape my thoughts and my opinions by having these conversations, you know, and these conversations aren't really referenceable, even though I try to. I always mention, I'm like, oh, I had a conversation with my friend such and such, and we talked about this. But then Foucault said this. Yeah, so it's kind of really idiotic. And I'm like, I wonder if I'm the only person who cheats in this way.
No.
And kind of like, okay, if I can get away with doing this in academia, like being, you know, having a very terrible, porous approach to quote unquote being academic. And maybe if I'm not the only one, maybe all academics are cheats and swindlers, right? And so like academia is the process of like swindling and kind of like convincing people of your authority when it's all completely bullshit, when you've basically just handpicked a handful of, you know, like irrelevant kind of like, oh, maybe in my case it is irrelevant. Well, it is both irreverent and irrelevant, like sources to build your non-existent argument on.
I mean, well, when you look at what contemporary academics is, by the time you move into this kind of endless process of publishing things and going to conferences, and some academics are forced to produce really short pieces or series of small published papers that represent their research as a whole, and that's partly down to some institutions and universities moving towards a more quota-based system for departments, in that they need to publish a certain amount of things, or research-wise do a certain amount of things in order to keep their position, and sometimes to maintain their funding. So then you get increasingly, or really high rate of papers that are produced by certain departments or universities that thinly spread the amount of knowledge across a series of papers rather than just concisely in one or two. So if you have this longer series of replications, it's actually really annoying for the academics themselves, for starters, but the outcome is that the knowledge is spread thin, so it feels more like the factory production of knowledge.
And thankfully that has occurred, because that means that artists can count every exhibition that they do as quote unquote publications. My research is put out into the public sphere. Like, artists would hate me saying this, but really, like, like, if you count group exhibitions, or like things that you put out into the world, like, even like now Instagram posts, like last night I made a link tree, and potentially it's an artwork referencing Linktree, like so I could easily like write about my Linktree artwork. Yeah, like I could basically write my Linktree artwork, publish it on some website as a Linktree, show it in as a video form in some gallery space, and before I know, that's like
it's bizarre
3
in a way, because
publications.
everything's online, and for some reason we've moved into a world where we need an audience for every aspect of our lives. Now everyone's probably wondering, what has this got to do with classical music? Well, I was actually wanting to use academia as an interesting world in which both you and I engage with academia, aside from our practices as artists through our PhD research. We work in universities and academic institutions that are, of course, Western-oriented in its education model, and, we're both in Western countries, you in Australia and me now in the UK. So I've been trying to kind of link this together with classical music, having thought about it for a while. And I think this is the way. And in fact, what it brings me back to is a conversation we had before about the questionable cyclical nature of referencing itself, and how, if we were to hypothetically trace back all these references in all academic texts, a lot of the crux of academia probably blossoms out of a rather small pool of references. I'd say 17th, 16th, 5th, maybe even 15th century in Europe. But, it's more likely 17th century during the Enlightenment period, given how much that period itself has shaped much of what academia research and research looks like at a tertiary level. So how does this link to classical music? So in classical music, when you go and you book a concert from that same period of time, so the 15th, 16th, 17th century, with, very notable organizations, institutions and ensembles. So for example, in Australia, it'll be the big MPAs like state orchestras, Australian Chamber Orchestra, etc. We keep playing the same repertoire. So in a sense, we continually replicate and reference this same historical experience from the past, and we just project it into a contemporary sphere and listenership as the ideal experience of this particular art form. So my question for you, James, is, do you think, from the perspective of someone who once studied classical music and who is now an artist, do you think this presents a similar issue or sets of challenges that we've talked about in terms of academia?
I'm glad I escaped classical music because I wouldn't have had the self-application and self-discipline to have got anywhere. Whereas in art, it's much more relaxed, maybe. There's a more willingness to have conversations around bad art. it's actually really fun to rip apart bad art and kind of like unpack it and learn from it and say, you know, like it was good once, but now it's bad, like because we've moved on. Like we have a new context for things, you know, like what things that were bad once becomes really interesting and good now for the times. Yeah, whereas I think classical music has this thing where it aims for like an idea of perfection in a way, because it's so big of a organizational thing to do a big orchestral work or whatever. Like, yeah, like maybe it loses some of its playfulness and loses its ability to take risk and loses the ability to kind of like see it as a creative art form that could be pushed and pulled and challenged. And also, you know, like maybe what we think now is kind of like the perfect way of playing is not. It's actually like, you know, a mutated version of what, you know, like Beethoven would have wanted once. Like, isn't there the argument that Beethoven's meant to be played at 5,000 times the speed at what it's meant to be played now? Like,
because we don't know
so
what he
like,
meant.
yeah, and also it's that crazy thing where, yeah, maybe Beethoven did want people to like play super fast so that they would fuck it up, like, because that would be super punk, right? And yeah, and like even boring old Mozart, like my favorite work of Mozart's is The Musical Joke. It's that crazy thing where Mozart was like a little bitch because he was basically mocking all the other composers around that were just like, you know, like producing music in a kind of like formulaic and mechanical way. And so he wrote this musical joke mocking them, like writing terrible like pieces of repetitive music to get at, you know, like his peers. Like, I'm like, where's the spirit of classical music in the contemporary practice of it? Like classical music had this, you know, like dynamic, it was so contested, like it had these passions and it had fun and joy, you know, and I think contemporary art in a way has that. Like there is, you know, like that structure of the biennales, and but there's always new waves of artists like coming up in the works who propose alternative ideas and who want to like crush what's already up and pull and rip it apart. And I'm like, if classical music has that sense of dynamic risk taking and being able to absorb these disruptions, like it would be such a powerful medium. You know, like if you could actually embody the spirit of Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn and whoever, like, you know, it would be so much more exciting. You'd make shit tons more money from it.
I mean, that's what I think as well. Even with the money, they would, if you plan it out long term, they would definitely make more. So, for example, a lot of smaller in size ensembles and chamber groups like Ensemble Offspring in Sydney and Speak Percussion down in Melbourne, they do a lot of the really cool collaborations and they attract substantial audience numbers. But when it comes to, you know, bigger organizations, and given the previous conversations I've had in the prior episodes, the main undercurrent as to the primary reason they fear any risk taking seems to be an economic one. Being dictated in this way, the result is we hear the same kind of stuff, and they've substantially cut down on working with the new or with the living practitioners, despite having flourished doing so in the 70s and 80s. And you're right, they should certainly imbue the spirit of people like Haydn beyond simply playing his music. And yet, you know, another example of this more adventurous and unexpected types of music from Haydn himself is a work that I think is one of your favorites, the symphony with the staged leaving, the Farewell Symphony.
Yeah, it was like so cool because it was like an act of protest, you know, like who would think that playing classical music would be an act of protest? You know, like for people who don't know, it's kind of like that thing where the person who commissioned the work
Yeah.
or commissioned the orchestra, like wouldn't let them go home to see their family because he's like, entertain me, right? And so the musicians were like, what the fuck, we're tired, we want to see our what they did was they wrote this piece of music where each musician would like deliberately leave the orchestra or whatever, and when they stopped playing they would blow out the candle and just leave the stage, and then in the end there would be only the conductor left, and then you know the king or whatever like realized like how important you know like it was for these artists to kind of like have time off for themselves and just be not slaves, right? And so like through art you could like you know carry this really amazing message, and I'm like, why can't classical music kind of like reflect the times and comment on you know the politics of the times? I mean, like if they're so worried about making money, I'm like, fucking look at Hamilton.
And we cut to a quick second intermission before we return to our conversation all about Hamilton. So for this second musical intermission is another selection from James, this time from revered composer, musician and sound artist Pauline Oliveros. Here is an excerpt of her 1967 work, Bye Bye Butterfly. so much money. An unbelievable amount of money.
People would pay $2,000 for tickets.
I
You
know.
know, like if classical music can kind of like challenge itself to such a degree and to make such a political statement towards its social relevance, people would pay shitloads to go see it, you know, and
Exactly.
yeah, and then it'll open up like so much breathing space and an opportunity, right? Like I just think it's incredible. I actually personally like hate musicals.
Would really bad if I started like rapping something from it now, so I won't.
Okay.
Okay, I won't rap then. But if we break down Hamilton, from aside from the money, yes, it's wildly successful to a point where musical theatre, which some people will argue is the contemporary counterpoint of opera, it's more successful than any of those things as a single production. It's this cultural phenomenon because it managed to integrate things that weren't considered traditional or expected, in a way that was so undeniably interesting and creative. And it was just, it's just amazing storytelling. But if we look at it from another point, so if we look at it in terms of casting, it was undeniably diverse. For example, in the original cast, you have Philippa Sue, who plays Hamilton's wife, Eliza, and then you have, the composer himself, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and then you have Christopher Jackson, who plays George Washington himself. So the plain fact here is that it didn't matter. It doesn't matter who they cast. They cast who was good. So theatre, opera, and to an extent art and music, it's all enveloped in this very high degree of spectacle anyways, that if you're going to tell a story successfully and execute it well enough with some degree of authenticity, considered thought, and etc., the idea of such a diverse cast or telling such diverse stories is not going to interfere with how well the story is being told. It's so dramatized already. Why does it visually need to meet our expectations in terms of casting or costuming? And, hint, hint, I am implying, some of the tactics that are still employed by opera companies to exoticize characters through costume or makeup or, to get some of the singers to tan up. And for example, if you're playing the lead in Verdi's Aida, that tends to happen. Hamilton is proof that if you tell the story well and it's artful, it doesn't matter as much or at all what anybody looks like or how the story is told. So, bringing it back to classical music as a practice and a genre loves to paint itself as apolitical. Firstly, because it's supposedly the classical tradition, and again, it goes back to this ideal representation of absolute truth and of human emotion, and anything that is absolute supposedly cannot be tied down to a specific time or place. So despite us now being in the 21st century, they've conveniently constructed this image to avoid having to address anything that's happening day to day by wholly separating itself from the situation.
Music has always been political. Composers have made art because they were angry or passionate about things that they felt really strongly about, and to kind of like take that away from the piece of music, I'm like, that's just like turning it into a piece of like zombie art that no one can really connect to. No wonder why like people find classical music boring.
And also, if we look at the structure of how to get a new piece on stage, is that there is a commissioner, or more likely for something like an orchestra or an opera company, you'll have a commissioning board. And sometimes, depending on where you are or who you are, it is akin to a system from 100 years ago. So it hasn't changed that drastically. And if you are where I am now, which is London, there is still the remains of a rather dominant aristocracy, and they have a lot of sway as art patrons of major performing arts companies. And you have patrons in a similar fashion that maybe you would have had in the past. For example, I have one. And for several recent works, he's been the primary driver for new music and commissioning of new music. So that idea of that level of commissioning of how art and music is produced is not a historical one, it still functions in that same way.
Yeah, but that also like devalues the patron. Like it just assumes that the patron are kind of stodgy, boring people who enjoy stodgy, boring music. Like if you're actually really smart, like if you've got 5 orchestras in a city, what you would do is kind of like collude with each other and like create different characteristics, or kind of like the politics between each of these orchestras will be like really competitive. And once you put that, you know, like maybe one orchestra could be like, you know, the queer orchestra, or the next one could be like, you know, the ethnic orchestra, and one's like more punk, and one like reinvents kind of like old, you know, reinvents Mozart or whatever. Like if you've got all these, you know, like opposing contestations that you can manufacture, like you could actually make the aristocracy excited and pick sides.
Yeah.
And then when when aristocracy picks sides and decide to kind of like bet against each other, they'll put shitloads of money in. You know, like people with money love betting against, you know, like their nemesis, right? Like who doesn't? Yeah, right. And so you just get a bunch of rich people together, kind of like tweak out what they kind of like, and then just push it to the extreme. And so, you know, like they'll be confronted, they'll be excited, you know, and I'm like, why are all these organizations so dumb that they would just like, you know, just continue to replicate and perform in such a way that's just like boring as batshit? Like, no wonder why they're leaking money. No wonder why like people are dying out, not paying any interest in them. Like, you know, like what would be exciting is like if you've got a few really conservative ones and then a really kind of like progressive ones, and they're constantly battling each other out. Like that's exciting. Like people would pay to watch it as a sport. You know, like if conductors started fighting with each other and like dissing each other in public, it would be so exciting.
I'm just trying to think if that's happened anytime recently, because there are so many that don't actually like each other. But there's too much decorum or tradition for them to leak that publicly, I think. So then, do you think it's a matter of class? For example, when you go to a classical concert, you know, you're paying to an extent, you're paying to have a certain bourgeois experience from the past. You know, you dress in a certain way, your ticket costs a certain amount, often around $100 or at least $100 in Australia. You know, you have dinner near the opera house, you sit in a certain way, you clap 3 times at the end. There's a certain order that's required in the experience of classical music.
Yeah, like definitely. Like I think one of the reasons why my parents, being kind of like migrants and so obsessed with quote unquote high art from the Western perspective, was, you know, like forcing me to have these lessons that I pretty much just like frittered away. I think give me that sense of being just as good as white people. Because, you know, like when they walk down the street, you know, like they spoke English with a terrible accent. They'll be, you know, like doing piecework. They'll be doing humiliating work that no one else wanted to do. And so they would invest so much money and time into, you know, like making their children enter kind of like these realms of high art, you know, so that their children, when they could become adults, could, you know, like sit and perform these rituals of status and class, right? And so their children wouldn't be bent down by the society in a way that they were, you know, and felt that they would be excluded. But little did they know that, you know, like the society would continue to, you know, exploit and treat their highly educated, highly skilled, you know, like these children, like, and exploit them in different ways, because, you know, like racism is really adaptable. Yeah, but I think what's actually really interesting about class is, you know, like people with class don't worry about class. You know, like people with money don't worry about money. And so like if you're demonstrating or you're performing class, like it actually means that you're not classy. You know, like the ultimate marker of class would be to like, you know, go to a selective school, you know, like go to like these big, you know, like institutions and, you know, like know where your forks and plates are and, you know, like, you know, how to eat an entree and like mispronounce words. So, but it's kind of like, yeah, so like if you're able to perform class and privilege, the ultimate marker of class and privilege is to subvert it, like to not care that you have class or privilege.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so like I think what's really interesting now is that like a lot of like immigrant children who've like achieved and reached these, you know, like higher echelons of class, they're like, that's fucked. You know, I'd rather like go hang out with my mates down at the pub, like rather than perform these dumb, stodgy things. And that's class. You know, like class is realizing that none of this shit matters. Like what really matters is your relationships and your networks that will always inevitably protect you.
And even you and I, both being second generation Australian Asian or Asian Australian, I don't know which one to say first.
When
it depends on what grant you're trying to get.
Well, then I'm Asian Australian. But even if you and I enter these spaces, which I'm sure we both have, and these spaces are designed to be exclusive, and I'll quickly explain to anyone who might not know what we're getting at, but for example, with me being a composer in classical music, it'll probably happen more often. So sometimes when you're a composer, you're sent out for an event or you're invited to meet a certain group of patrons for a concert. For example, through the Sydney Conservatory of Music, or, you know, you meet an ensemble and, there will often be much wealthier people there who are there to support the arts. And the amount of times I've been mistaken for waitstaff has been insane. Or the amount of times I've been mistaken for being someone else's nurse or their carer is also ridiculous. And it's probably because I'm a little younger than they would expect. And it's definitely because I simply don't look like what a composer should look like.
Right, yeah. Like you're occupying a space that doesn't even exist in her mind.
Yeah.
Right, and so when you are able to beat them at their own game and kind of like, oh, do you know this about Mozart? They'll be like, what the fuck? You know, and you know, what's really fun is that, you know, like, you know, when you're kind of like, when you're hiding or when you're out of sight, but then you shock them with kind of like the class that your parents have, you know, like imbued into you, like it kind of dislodges their sense of comfort. And that's always really fun to play with. It's like, oh, so you thought that I was a carer? Fuck you. Like, I can kick you to the curb with how much knowledge I have. So get fucked. Like, that always feels super satisfying. And I'm always kind of like so grateful that my parents have allowed me to have, you know, the education, like, and they've invested so much time to allow me to have this kind of power. Yes, it's not economic power, but it's a power where I could move between any class of people and feel like I can contribute and kind of like dislodge people's expectations. I think that's super amazing.
Sometimes I think it's more powerful, even, because you no longer feel beholden to any set of behaviors.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that, you know, like when you're an outsider in that way, you're willing to take risks because you don't care. You're like, oh, ooh, like you're not going to care about my art. You know, like no one ever has, right? Like, ooh, you're not going to let me in. I'll go to Cabramatta and eat really great food. Yeah, like none of, like none of their niceties and what they think are important are actually important. And in a way, they're almost scared of us because like our superpowers actually are extraordinarily threatening. And I'm glad my parents gave me those.
I'm so glad my mother gave me that. The power to think differently and to not worry that much about fitting in. I mean, occasionally it is a problem, particularly when you're in an environment where no one else is like that. You do start to feel pressure, but I think as I'm getting older, that's beginning to change.
Totally. Like people always kind of like call like a tiger mum or whatever is like a bad thing. And I'm like, like if you want to see what a tiger mum is, go to a fucking footy or netball game. Sometimes your parents put you into situations that you're not comfortable with. And sometimes if you're able to survive that and endure that process, then a lot of times that's quite amazing. Like you come out at the other end with like, a big dose of perspective and a big dose of like being aware of what's actually really important.
So would you say, like, coming from all our experiences being kind of cross-cultural in our practice and our identity, is it partly our responsibility not just to have these conversations like the one we're having now, but in our work to constantly challenge these systems in terms of action, challenging these Western systems, whether or not they're art making, classical music, or academics?
I don't know. Like I think because we've always had to work and rub against these norms or these conventions, like I think we're naturally just quite unconventional anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's not that much of a effort to, like provide an alternative perspective to a conversation, right? Like it just comes naturally. And you're always constantly thinking on your feet, and you're always constantly thinking, oh, what's the alternative of this? Because you've always been at the alternative end of these conversations. And so potentially it gives you like really thorough and rigorous thinking and like these actually amazing concepts. And yeah, like I think it's just amazing that we can exist in between and also without these spaces. Like we don't actually need these spaces. I think we're just kind of like sickos and kind of like want to hang around and troll people because it's hilarious because we can, right? Like it's like, yes, how can we troll privilege? Yeah, but also in saying that, like we also have to kind of like acknowledge our limitations, and our prejudices. Like existing in this colonized nation, like we inevitably kind of like absorb its violence and its kind of like prejudices and its hierarchies. And so yeah, it's always good to kind of like fight against people who are higher up on the hierarchy than you and who have more power. But there's always that chance that as you get comfortable in your practice or whatever, you start to implement your own violence on the people who are socially or like who have less than you. Yeah, and it's actually really important to have these conversations because basically we're trying to keep ourselves in check. Like we're trying to keep our conversations thorough by speaking the word racism, because racism is not just the purview of whiteness. Like racism is in everyone. Like we fear people, we're scared of people who are different than us. And so if we are able to talk about it, it means that other people are able to talk about it. And when other people are able to talk about it, they're able to think about approaching things in a more kind of like fun way, you know, like it's actually challenging them. Like why don't you want to like move around the world and be challenged? It's like actually super fun, and like so many new ideas come out of being uncomfortable, you know, and being challenged by your friends and saying, dude, that's racist, and you're like, oh, is it? Oh fuck, you know, and then yeah, and then you create and you produce art in ways that you just don't do if you're taking everything for granted, you know, and it makes the art so much more interesting. Yeah, and it's not just only about racism, you know, like it's any form of, you know, like injustice, you know, and if you're able to think about your place in kind of like these forms of injustice, then your art and your practice will be so much more interesting and nuanced, right? Like and people would, you know, like everyone suffers from pain, you know, like everyone suffers when they're rejected or when they're told that they're not enough, and everyone has felt that. And when those things emerge in your art and there's a honesty and truth in that, then I think that's important because we're actually reflecting kind of like the human condition.
Well, I have nothing else to add. That was perfect and enlightening. I hope anyone who's listening will think about those things, especially when they go into thinking about art making, whether you're a musician of any genre, visual artist, filmmaker, or creative of every shape. I hope you have a little think about what your practice means and what you can do and what you can think about and what you can express. In fact, you've probably answered everything I had on my mind this week. So I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to you, James, for letting me record this conversation for the podcast this time round.
No, not a problem at all. It's so fun.
Once again, thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm pretending like we don't do this every week already. But if you want to find more information about James, I've linked all the info about him and his upcoming works and research below, as well as information about all the things we've covered in this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you all next time.